All right, say I record. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, sir.
My name is Mr. Masemula, and I'm a grade 10 geography teacher. So today we are going to introduce a new topic, and under the main topic, population. So we've already spoke about the population structure, population growth, and the other topics under population. So today we are going to introduce a new topic, which is called population movement. So today for grade 10's third term, we are going to talk about population movement. What we are going to do today, we are only going to look at the core concepts of population movement, which is migration. You can call it movement or migration. So we are only going to look at the core concepts of population movement. We are not going to go deep into the main aspects of population movement, which is the reasons why people move, the positive and negative impacts of movement. We're only going to look at the core concepts of population movement. Before we can even start with our session, do you guys all understand what we mean by population movement? Do you have an idea of what it is when we talk about population movement? What comes into your mind actually when you talk about population movement? Anyone with an idea? Howard?
Is a mass movement of people, sir.
The mass movement of people, that's true. The other Mahlangu, I saw you raising a hand as well.
I think Howard has said it. It's a mass movement of people, or it's a different group of people moving from one place to another.
Exactly. So when you talk about population movement, we are actually talking about the movement of people from one place to another. We also call this migration. You can either call it migration or population movement. It still means the same thing. So when you talk about population movement, we are talking about the movement of people from one place to another. If you can check from this picture, from what we see in the picture, there are people moving, people having their bags, which means they are moving from one place to another. And remember, we have different reasons why people move from one place to another. But for this lesson, we are not gonna get deep into that. We are only going to look at the core concepts of migration. So what we're going to look at today, we're going to look at the kinds of migration. And then in our next lesson, we are going to look at the factors that affects their movement. But for today, we are only going to look at the kinds of migration, which is the kind of movement. The first one is international migration. So when we talk about international migration, we are talking about the movement of people from one country to another. For example, you'll find people moving from South Africa to Zimbabwe, from South Africa to Mozambique. When you find such movement, we call them international migration. People are moving from one country to a different country. The second core concept of migration is immigration. Immigration, it is the movement of people out of the country. So when you find people moving out of the country, we call that immigration. And we also have immigration. So immigration is the opposite of immigration. It is the movement of people into the country. Or for immigration, if people are moving from South Africa to Ethiopia, they are moving out of South Africa to a different country. We call that immigration. But when you find people moving into South Africa, as it is in this case, you find a lot of people coming to South Africa from Zimbabwe, from Nigeria, from Namibia, and the other countries. We call that immigration. It is when people move into the country. Am I making any sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, so it is very important to know the difference between emigration and immigration. Immigration actually means the movement of people out of the country. So when they are moving out of the country, in a South African context, when you find people moving out of South Africa to a different country, we call that emigration. And when you find people coming into South Africa from different countries, we call that immigration. So it's actually the opposite of each other. The next concept, it's a regional migration. Regional migration, it's actually the movement of people from one region to another within a country. You can find people moving from a southern region to a northern region. In many cases, you find people moving from Limpopo, in a South African context, you find people moving from Limpopo to stay in Devon, some from Devon to stay in Pretoria, from a different region to a different region, from one region to a different region. We also have rural urban migration. So this is actually a movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. For example, you'll find people from Siyabusa, KwaNdebele. We all know Siyabusa is a very rural area in KwaNdebele. Or Mteti, there's a place called Mteti, a very rural area in KwaNdebele. So when you find people moving from a rural area to an urban area, in a South African context, you find people moving from Siyabusa, KwaNdebele to Pretoria. We call that rural urban migration. And then we also have urbanization. Urbanization is actually an increase in the number of people living in urban areas. So when this rural urban migration happens, it leads to urbanization. Urbanization, it is the increase in the number of people in the urban areas. In the case of, in a South African context, you find a lot of people coming to Pretoria, which is the case in the modern life. You find a lot of people coming from Limpopo, from KZN, from Rustenburg. They all come to permanently stay at Pretoria or Johannesburg. When that number of people increase in the urban areas, we call that urbanization. Urbanization is actually the increase in the number of people in the urban areas. And then we also have the last two key concepts of migration. We have voluntary migration. So voluntary migration, when we talk about voluntary migration, we're talking about when people just decide to move from one place to another. It means that people are not pushed by anything. They just decide to move from one place to another. For example, you find people moving from maybe Limpopo coming to Pretoria voluntary, so maybe to look for a job, to look for better services, to look for better education. Yeah. And then when people move voluntary without being pushed, we call that voluntary migration. The opposite of it, it's forced migration. When you find people being forced to move from one place to another, for example, you can find people moving because of natural disasters. Maybe there are natural disasters where they stay. We call that forced migration. It means that people are forced to move from where they stay to a different place. So is there anyone who have a question regarding the core concepts that we have spoke about already? Anyone with a question? So it is very important for you guys to understand these kinds of migration in order for us to proceed with this population movement lesson. No, I see your hands is raised.
Yes. Can I ask about the regional migration? Can you also call it provincial migration, or it's not the same?
Remember that you find, remember that the region and the province, it's different things. It cannot be called provincial migration, because when we talk about provincial migration, we're specifically talking about people moving from one province to a different province. In some cases, you can find two provinces in the same region. You understand? You can find two provinces in the same region. So we cannot call regional migration as provincial migration. Provincial migration specifically means people who moves from one province to a different province. Am I making any sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Mahlangu, Howard.
So, sir, I just want to ask, what is called when move from one continent to another? What concept do we use?
Mahlangu,
Sir?
can you please repeat your question? I couldn't hear you well.
Okay, I say, what is called when people move from one continent to another?
Oh, it's a continental migration, that one. It's not the same as international migration. International migration, it's when they move from a country to a different country, but it could be in the same continent. But continental migration, it's when they move from one continent to a different continent.
Okay.
Anyone else with a question? Okay, so I'm gonna give you guys a class activity which we're going to discuss in our next lesson before we proceed with the factors that affects migration. Before we can start with that lesson, we're going to look at this activity. So what I need you guys to do is you need to use a table or a mind map to differentiate the 5 different types of migration that we spoke about today, and give a practical example that is relevant to our everyday lives for each type of migration. So what you need to do is explain in your own understanding what that kind of migration is, and then you give an example, as I was giving examples such as the one in a South African context of rural-urban migration, which I gave an example that when someone moves from Siabuswa or Kwaggafontein, which are rural areas around Gwandebel, to Pretoria, then we call that rural-urban migration. So you also need to give a practical example that is relevant to our everyday lives. Né? And then we are going to look at this activity in our next lesson, and then we are going to start with the factors that affect migration. So you guys need to use at least a table or a mind map to differentiate. And when you differentiate, you actually need to explain how it differs with the other concept, and then you give a practical example. So we are going to start with that in our next lesson. And for today, our lesson ends here. Thank you very much, guys. And if you happen to have another question that comes up into your mind, and then we're going to discuss it first before we proceed with our next lesson. Thank you very much, guys, and have a very wonderful day.